Amen. Well, it's been a few years back now, but maybe you have had a similar experience. Zandra and I boarded a 747 with a group of Joplin District Nazarenes, and we were on our way to Kenya. We were going to be on a 2-week work and witness trip in Kenya. Now, just in case you don't know, a 747 is what they call a jumbo jet. This plane is huge. I mean, we pass through different zip codes getting to our seats. It's a huge plane. I mean, for example, we walked through first class, business class, premier rewards class, economy plus class, and then 20 minutes later, we finally reached our seats in coach, which is just a fancy, nice name for steerage, because that's where we were. You know, I might be over-exaggerating maybe a little bit, not really, but I might be over-exaggerating just a little bit, but you kind of get the picture. There were a lot of people in a really cramped space. And what I found interesting is that as we began all the pre-flight procedures, the sections of the plane that I had walked through, they began to take on a lot more distinction. For example, the curtains suddenly closed. You shall not pass! I mean, it was one of those deals. If you needed to get up and stretch your legs or use the bathroom, the stewards and stewardesses, they kindly said, use your own section. Don't go up there. It's not allowed. And these kind of distinctions became even more apparent when the food started coming out, because I'm pretty sure I saw them breaking out the fine china up in first class. The rest of us in steerage, we had those pre-packaged meals that came out of a vending machine. You know what I'm talking about? Well, later in the flight, folks in first class, they got a nice warm hand towel for their personal comfort. Those of us in coach, we had to use our sleeves on our shirts to wipe the sweat off, right? And so by the time this all happened, I was getting the message, you don't belong. You're not part of the in-group. It's not that we don't like you. It's just we're better than you are. You know? It was one of those deals. And I hope you can tell by now that I'm trying to joke. I'm trying to play. Sort of. C.S. Lewis, he writes about this unfortunate common human experience in an essay that he wrote called The Inner Ring. Now, Lewis tells us that in every area of society, whether that's school or church, workplace, there's these little groups of people who are on the inside. And he says these groups they're never formal. No one votes on who gets in. But regardless of whether or not you're on the in club, it's reflected on subtle things like use of nicknames, inside jokes, special handshakes, invitations to special events. Lewis, he goes on to describe the reality of these rings by stating that what actually seems like an inner ring turns out to be an onion. It's because once you make it to a certain ring or level of the in club, you discover that there's another ring to go to. And this is maddening because no one really knows how many layers there are to an onion. Interesting. Now, the shadow truth of the rings that we try to jump through to be part of the in crowd is simply this. Lewis says, we never arrive at the sense of worth that we desire. Because no matter how many levels that we move through, we're actually still the same person. Fascinating. But the desire still remains, doesn't it? In fact, Jesus' disciples, they wrestled with this. James and John, do you remember the story? James and John actually approached Jesus and asked if they could be part of his inner ring of power. You remember the story? They asked Jesus, hey, can we have the 2 seats to your left and your right when you come into your glory? I mean, surely if you get to that level, of desire to be on the inside, finally something will be satisfied when you get to that place, right? And I can imagine Jesus was kind of like, guys, really? So Jesus, here's the deal about Jesus. He was constantly getting into trouble for his views about who was in and who was out, and about God's desire for outsiders to become insiders. You ever discover that about Jesus? If you look at the New Testament with those eyes, you'll see it all the time. See, for me, one of the more striking stories from Jesus' ministry that illustrates God's heart for relationships and community, it actually comes to us today, my friends, wrapped in disguise. It comes wrapped in disguise, and it displays our secret for strong relationships for today. The final one that we have, final secret for strong relationships is this: inclusion. Inclusion. And the story that we're going to look at today is from Matthew 15, 21 through 28. And so I want to turn your attention to the text now. Jesus went away from there and withdrew from the district of Tyre and Sidon. And a Canaanite woman from that region came out and began to cry out, saying, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is cruelly demon-possessed." But he did not answer her a word. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, "Send her away, because she keeps shouting at us." But he answered and said, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and began to bow down before him, saying, "Lord, help me." And he answered and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table." Then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. Now this passage, this story, is fascinating, but it's also confusing. See, at first glance, it kind of makes Jesus look kind of mean. Kind of like, you can't come in on the inner side, right? It looks as if Jesus is defining who is part of the in crowd and who's not. But I'm wondering if there's something at play here. Something that will capture our attention. Because you see, we know that Matthew, he retells his gospel. He retells the Old Testament story of God in and through the life of Jesus. And he does so in such a way that it reminds us as readers of God's original purposes that he gave to Abraham and Abraham's kids. That they would be a light unto the nations and a means through which all peoples would be blessed. You see, we know from Jesus' ministry that he actually welcomed women into his inner circle. He welcomed them to be disciples. He actually had women who were the first evangelists of the church to spread the news about the resurrection. And we know that Jesus was also amazed by the faith of outsiders. Do you remember the story of the Roman centurion? And yet, what's interesting is, he was also amazed at the lack of faith from his own hometown of Nazareth. And because of that, he could do no miracles there. Maybe this passage isn't so cut and dry. Maybe it has a different purpose. Maybe Jesus is trying to help his disciples understand the heart of God and God's desire that the whole world would be saved and would become part of the family, part of the inside ring, if you will. And so I wonder how this passage might sound to us if we were to look at it from the perspective of Jesus giving a pop quiz. We have some educators in the room. You know how fun it is to give pop quizzes. Emphasis on the pop part. It's unexpected, right? Well, this is kind of a pop quiz that Jesus is giving to two different groups of people. The group that thought they were in the in club, and the one person who just knew that she never would be. It's fascinating. But the purpose for both was the same: to draw them to the heart of God so that they might know him and experience him. So this encounter in Jesus' ministry, it happened in a region called Tyre and Sidon. Those are Phoenician cities. They're pretty far north of Jewish territory. The Jews and these folks who lived in this region, they were really not on good speaking terms, if I can put it that way. Jesus' disciples, well, they definitely would have interpreted these folks to be on the outside. They would have been outsiders. But interestingly enough, Jesus takes them straight there. He takes them there. Jesus had made an interesting statement in the presence of his disciples about these perceptions that they held in Matthew 11:20 through 22. He says this: "Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! For if the miracles had occurred in," where's that? Tyre and Sidon, which occurred in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. Nevertheless, I say to you, it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you. Now that's interesting. It's as if Jesus is saying, even the folks that you think are on the outer rings and at the bottom of the barrel, those folks would have repented if they had seen the miracles that you saw. So this woman that we encounter in Matthew 15 would have been regarded as by Jesus' disciples, as an enemy, an outcast, someone to be excluded, not included. But this woman comes to Jesus with a cry of absolute humility, absolute dependence. She cries out, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David." And I want you to know that Lord here is a title. The word in the Greek is kyrios, which is a title of respect and reverence. It's a title that's given to God. Now, does she know that she's talking with God in the flesh? Does she know that he is the Messiah? We don't know. But this we do know. She knows that there's something more to this Jesus than him being a mere carpenter. There's something more here at play. And perhaps that's part of the lesson that Jesus is trying to teach her, a lesson about who he really is and what the heart of God is really like. Matthew 15, verse 23. But he did not answer her a word. So the woman appeals to Jesus with humility and reverence, and it seems like he's acting as if he didn't hear her. Seems like he's acting as if she's not around him. More interesting is the fact that Matthew does nothing to hide that fact. He doesn't. In fact, it seems like he's actually trying to draw attention to it. Now, I believe Matthew does this because he knows something that we as readers do not. He knows that this is a pop quiz from Jesus. He knows how this story is going to end. But for now, he wants us to wrestle with this. Whatever this is that Jesus is up to, he wants us to wrestle with it. Now, at this point, this woman could have made a decision to walk away, right? I mean, she's got to decide, who do I really think this Jesus is? How much am I really willing to trust him? How far am I really willing to go? See, that's the first part of her pop quiz. But she's not the only one who's getting a pop quiz. I wonder if Jesus ignored what the woman said so that he could see what his disciples would do. Do his disciples really understand who Jesus is? Who he's revealed himself to be? Let's look at their response. It's pretty strong. It's filled with confidence that, yeah, Jesus, we're right, and you're going to affirm us. And his disciples came and implored him, saying, send her away because she keeps shouting at us. Oh, man. It makes me wonder, is this a little bit overstated? You know, it makes you wonder. The text doesn't indicate that the woman had said anything to the disciples. But they're definitely including themselves in Jesus' inner ring, aren't they? She's bothering us, Jesus. Make her go away. Right? She's not part of our club, Jesus. I wonder if one of God's most misunderstood characteristics is his desire to welcome everyone into his family, into his club. Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, he says that if he had to summarize a lot of the Old Testament teachings that have to do with like foods that could be eaten or not eaten, things that were clean and unclean, Phil said he would do it under this category: no oddballs allowed. Now, there were important principles for these instructions. And believe it or not, they were actually signs or means of God's grace to the people, expressions of his care at that time. But slowly over time, you see, those rules were used as grounds for the exclusion of oddball people. People who couldn't measure up. It's one of the reasons that Jesus clashed with the religious leaders of his day so much. Now, if human experience teaches us anything, it reveals how very easy it is for communities of people to become exclusive over time. It's so easy for communities of people to define who is in and who is out, who has worth, who doesn't have worth. And I believe the disciples were wrestling with this no oddballs allowed inheritance of teaching and mindset that they'd inherited. And I believe Jesus is trying to lead them out of that. So Jesus goes on to part 2 of the pop quiz, right? His next words are addressed to the disciples in response to their response to the woman. He answered and said, I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. Oh, man, Jesus, why did you say that? What's going on here? On numerous other occasions, Jesus makes it clear that he has come for the whole world, that he's not willing that any should perish. In fact, Matthew even records Jesus saying that, I say to you that many will come from east and west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. And so this is like code words for Gentiles. This is code words for all y'all, all of us, right? So remember, we've got some pop quizzes going on. And Jesus is the master teacher. You got to understand that. He understands that lectures and handouts, those things are great. But the best teacher of all is firsthand experience, isn't it? So Jesus, he appears to agree with his disciples for a moment. Yeah, guys, I'll get rid of her. You know, we've got no time for Gentiles or females. You know, all that second-rate riffraff. But isn't it interesting? Jesus doesn't send the woman away. They asked him to, but he didn't. He's watching to see how his disciples will respond. Will any of them catch on to what he's doing? Sadly, the answer is no, at least not right now. And during this whole back and forth with his disciples, the woman, she hears everything that is being said. And so this is actually the beginning of the second part of her pop quiz. See, she's got no one else to turn to, nowhere else to go. She's like a little mouse without a hole, right? She's knelt before Jesus in a posture of reverence and humility, and she's uttered a single phrase, Lord, help me. She doesn't understand what's happening in her life. She doesn't understand really what's happening in this encounter right now. She still calls him Lord, though. And so I'm wondering at this point, what's happening in the disciples' hearts? Is there something inside of them that is being touched? This is a cry from a desperate mother for her daughter who is in absolute agony. They've heard her call Jesus Lord. Is it possible? Is it possible that God is bigger and better than their preconceived notions? You see, I believe a seed is being planted here. It's a seed that will not be fully harvested in the lives of the disciples until after Pentecost, when Peter sees the Holy Spirit move upon a Gentile by the name of Cornelius. And in that moment, Peter's eyes are open to a staggering reality, and he says, I most certainly understand now that God is not one to show partiality, but in every nation, the man who fears him and does what is right is welcome to him. And friends, when the church came to grips with the heart of God, that it was His desire that the whole world would be saved, that all were welcome to be part of His family, it created a community that was unlike anything that had ever existed before in the world, and it changed history. And can I tell you, my friends, it still can. You're not nearly as excited about this as you should be. This is amazing. But friends, on this day, the disciples still aren't getting it. So Jesus speaks again. And the postures in the scene have not changed. You see, the woman is still on her knees begging for mercy. Jesus is still looking at his disciples, wondering if they're going to get it. And the disciples are still looking at her with disgust. And Jesus continues with his test. He answers and said, "It is not good to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs." So it's pretty clear here in what he's saying. Israel equals children. Dogs equals Gentiles, including this woman. Now, dogs in the time of Jesus, they're not really man's best friend as we experience them today. They were looked at as scavengers. They ate garbage. They were looked upon by the Hebrew people as being almost as unclean as pigs. And so Jesus, he's forcing his disciples to examine their perceptions, to examine their prejudices. What is really in their hearts? What they really believe about the value of a human being. You see, what Jesus has just done in this pop quiz, he's given voice to what they really believe. He's given voice to what's really in their heart and what they really think about people and what they really think about God. He's taken the contempt that they had for this woman and they've spoken it. He's spoken it. He's expressed their thoughts and feelings out loud in the presence of a real human being. Will any of those disciples speak up for the woman? Will any of the disciples love her, welcome her in? Unfortunately, not today. Now, they've still got some room to grow. They're still learning. And the disciples are going to do better as they go along, but not today. And so one of the questions that comes to us from this text is, how about us? How are we doing in this regard as present-day disciples? It's worthy of reflection. This is obviously a very difficult place for the woman to be, but there's something at play here with the word that Jesus uses for dog. It's actually quite playful. The word that Jesus uses for dog in the Greek, it actually means puppy. A little doggy. Little puppy. And so it actually gives the scene some humor. Jesus is cracking a joke. Okay? He softens the experience for the woman, and Jesus is dropping this playful hint to her. But will she get it? Will she run away? She could. Or is her love for her daughter so intense, and her trust in Jesus and His power to heal so deep? Is her faith in Jesus' compassion so strong that she's going to keep going? And her response is absolutely amazing. But she said, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs feed on the crumbs which fall from their master's table." So she picks up on what Jesus is doing here with the words, and she replies in kind. She's basically saying, "Yes, Lord, even the little doggies, even the little puppies get little crumblies from the table." She comes back at him with grace and grit and no small amount of wit. There's an element of playfulness here. Jesus started it. She responds with it. She understands what Jesus is doing. She understands that His opinion of her is not the same as His disciples at this point. Go ahead. Push me away. Make it look like you're pushing me away, Jesus, but I know your heart. I know who you are. I'm not going anywhere. By all means, you feed the kids first, but I know you've got something for me too. I can only imagine the look on those beleaguered disciples' faces. They have not seen someone show such confidence in Jesus or demonstrate such a risk-taking love. You see, they thought that they were encountering an inferior person, someone not worthy of being in the club. But it turns out she's their superior. It turns out she's their teacher and what a relationship with the Lord looks like. She's relating to Jesus on a level of understanding and humility and faith that actually kind of puts him to shame. And you see, this is the irony of a spirit of exclusion. Where a spirit of exclusion reigns, it's actually a mark of those farthest from the fellowship of the Trinity. Let me say that again. Where a spirit of exclusion reigns, it's actually a mark of those farthest from the fellowship of the Trinity. You see, when we exclude others, we don't just hurt those that we keep outside. We do damage to our own souls. But when we love others and welcome them into community, we participate in the very life of God. Pop quizzes are over. They're done. The grades are given out. And then Jesus said to her, "O woman, your faith is great. It shall be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at once. So Jesus' heart is full at this point. I guess you could say He's given these lines with some sanctified pride in His heart. You see, the word that He uses comes from a Greek word that means mega. Like the same word that we use to describe mega malls or mega churches. So Jesus actually says this woman has mega faith. He can't quite say so for His disciples yet. You see, it turns out that the most desirable club in the universe, it turns out to be the most humble and least exclusive. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are determined that the circle of love that they've shared from all eternity would be ceaselessly and shamelessly welcoming to all. And guess what? There's still room. I'm going to have my praise team come at this time, and I'm going to try and bring this plane in for a landing. Dale Galloway, he tells the story of a young boy by the name of Teddy. And Teddy wasn't the cool kid. He wasn't the smart kid. He wasn't the talented kid. Teddy slouched in his chair. He only spoke when others called upon him to do so, and when he did, it was just very short sentences. He didn't dress right, and he had smelly clothes, and by all accounts, he was rather a kind of humble, unattractive-looking kid. And Teddy's teacher, Miss Thompson, when she would grade his papers, she kind of actually got a little pleasure out of marking all of his answers that were wrong. She'd put a F at the top of his paper with a little flare. She might have known better if she had read his file. First grade, Teddy is a good boy. He shows promise, but he's got a poor home life. Second grade, Teddy's quiet and withdrawn. His mother is terminally ill. Third grade, Teddy's falling behind. His mother died this year. His father is uninvolved. Fourth grade, Teddy is hopelessly backward. His father moved away. He's living with his aunt, and he's deeply troubled. Well, Christmas came that year, and as is common, the kids brought presents to Miss Thompson, their teacher, and they were all very carefully wrapped, except for Teddy's. And so Miss Thompson would open them up one by one and show them off to the class. And when she got to Teddy's, there was a rhinestone bracelet with most of the stones missing. And there was a bottle of perfume that was mostly gone. And the other children began to laugh, but Miss Thompson kind of caught herself, and she snapped on the bracelet and said, "Isn't it beautiful?" And then she sprayed some of the perfume on, and she said, "Doesn't it smell beautiful?" And at the end of the day, Teddy approached her and very quietly said, "I'm really glad you liked my gifts, Miss Thompson. You smelled like my mom all day today." Mm-hmm. And after he left, Miss Thompson put her head on her desk and cried and asked God to forgive her and to help her see what he sees when she looks at a motherless boy. And when the children came back the next day, Miss Thompson was a new teacher. By the end of the year, Teddy was actually caught up to grade level thanks to Miss Thompson and her tutoring and investment in him. And after the last day of school, she didn't see Teddy for a while. But then one day she received a note. "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know that I'm graduating from high school and I'm second in my class. Mm-hmm. Love, Teddy." And 4 years later, another letter came and it said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know that I'm graduating first in my class in university. It's not been easy, but I liked it. Love, Teddy." And then 4 years later, another letter came and said, "Dear Miss Thompson, I wanted you to be the first to know that as of today, I am Theodore J. Steller, MD." How about that? And I want you, if you would, to come and sit where my mother would have sat at my ceremony, because you're the nearest thing to family that I've had. Love, Teddy. My friends, it all boils down to this: the ability to assign value to another human being and to welcome them into our lives and the life of God is one of the rarest and most precious gifts in the world. So I would encourage us all, let's value what God values. And what does God value? People. You see, in his club, no one's left out, except those who refuse to enter. So let's welcome and love people like he does.